coming. We are so excited. We've been working on planning this. Gosh, I don't know how long, Kathleen. A long time of pulling things together for you guys. And this is our roadmap for authentic instruction, particularly for language learners. But y'all, it's best practices for everybody. So what you're going to hear today is for everyone. And so what I want you to do, this is more like a think tank, more like a mindset. Take a deep breath, relax, and you're going to hear some things. You're like, oh, I already knew that. That will be there and get you set for the year. There'll be some new things. We're going to have 2 sessions. We'll do the morning where you're going to get to hear about neuro-linguistics, how the brain learns, what it does with, what is language in this mix. And we're going to let Kathleen Leos, I'm going to introduce her in a little bit, but she's going to tell you about some things we have in your bag. And then we're going to have a break, and you're going to have coffee, churros, and pan dulce, or little sweet rolls. Yes. So you'll have a chance to do that. And then the second part that we'll do is about our English language proficiency standards, but on a best practices level. What does it mean? What are we doing? And where are our students? What's the most important thing we know about language? Then you will have a fajita lunch from 11:30 to 12. After lunch, you guys are free to go. So just to give you an idea of what the day looks like, each of you should have a paper sack. We did that so everything wouldn't be flying all over the table. And we're going to go through that, let you know what's there. Be sure you sign. There is a sign-in sheet on every table where there were bags. Be sure to sign in so you can get credit for being here. And I'm going to let Kathleen Leos is going to let you know about the manual that's in there.
Morning. So I have so much to share with you, and I'm just so excited. They're adjusting that's it. I'm a little in the bag, what you'll see is a part 1 manual. And I'm going to talk to you today and tell you a story. And language learning, multiple language learning, is a story. It's our story, it's my story, it's your story, it's every student's story. And so I think it's the best place to start. What I did with the manual is took now 15, 20 years of research in neuroscience, empirical research around multiple language learning, transitioning from one language to another, and development language learning, and wrote a manual for you so that you have something to take with you today after we do this little presentation or exchange this morning. Also, there's a card in there. Back in 2014, I opened the Education Neuroscience Foundation, which takes empirical research and just synthesizes it, analyzes it, disseminates it, and we do a lot of training around that type of research. And this is specific for multiple language learners. So some things that you're going to hear today, you're going to go, because it's going to confront some of the either opinions or behavior research that you have taken for granted for a long period of time or that you've heard over and over again. And some of it is going to validate and reinforce what you're already doing in the classroom and understand that it's not only for, quote, language learners or multiple language learners or dual language learners or ESL students, it's for all students. And that's the beauty of the research. It just cuts through this kind of siloed approach to how we look at students based on assessment scores and proficiency levels, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the manual, there's the card, there is a survey. What I specifically am asking, I know that Dr. Wright has set out a survey with questions and answers, et cetera, et cetera. If you will also add things about language learning, specifically about language learning, that you want to know more, because after today's session, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to work with you on a more individual or cross-curricular or cross-grade level in-core curricular opportunity later on. I started to write part 2, and it's specific to language. So you're going to see some intros today, and then part 2 will delve into, of the manual, delve into the actual real specifics of language learning. And I decided not to do that because I really want some feedback. And so this is a real-time, real-world, real experience with you, and I'm really, really excited. So.
And the survey she mentioned is like 10 questions. Answer what you want to. Answer what you have an idea. If you have something to say, it's about mainly what we're doing after the snack, but there is an area on the bottom that says comments. That's what Kathleen is asking you to do. If you have some comments, there's something that you want to know more so about language, then if you'll just write those down, write them anywhere on the page, your name's not on it, just give us some feedback of what you knew, maybe you wanted to know more of, maybe what made sense. And this is just, again, we're just thinking together today. We're just sharing, we're looking at mindsets and how we walk into planning, how we walk into our classrooms. Okay, so you have that. You also have a pad and a pen. We're going to be jotting some things down. And so I'll have some questions. I'll say, okay, write down the name of the student you're thinking about. Okay, so you'll write that down. And then you can take all that with you when you finish. All right, y'all have any questions so far? Anything you all can continue eating, drinking? If you want to go get more coffee, more tea, please do, okay? Because this is for you all. This is for us to share back and forth. We want you all to feel really good about today and what you have, and that you have something to take back with you as you delve into your plan. Okay? All right, very good. All right, I think I'll introduce you.
Oh,
Okay. All right, and I'm going to read it because she has a very good part. Kathleen Leos is the former Assistant Deputy Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of English Language Acquisition. It's called OELA, in Title III, during the years of 2002 to 2008. In that capacity, she worked with 50 states, D.C., Puerto Rico, and outlying areas to develop standards. I'm kind of sure what these standards. Assessments and systems of accountability for English learners. And this was the first time that everyone was working together to develop those in public education in the United States. So she really was on the ground level of doing this. In 2008, she established the Global Institute in the Education Neuroscience Foundation, and it was to transform educational systems based on theory to practice. That's what we're doing today. This morning, you're going to hear a lot of theory, and after we have our break, it'll be more into practice. So taking what we hear, and now how do we get it into the classroom? How can we use it? How does that help us to be able to know what kids know? She also has the related information on language development of English, dual, and multi-language learners, and she's currently with the National Neuroscience Foundation offers professional learning institutes and workshops to demonstrate teaching strategies based on how the brain learns. So would y'all welcome Kathleen Leos?
well, thank you. I started this morning and have thought a lot about this and telling you, I want to share my story. How did all this get started? 1989, my eldest son sustained a traumatic brain injury. Now, he was 12 at the time, and his first language was English. His second language was Spanish. And he collided in an intersection in a very small, underdeveloped area of Dallas. He ran a stop sign, came back, collided with a van, and then was in a coma for a month. He was actually on life supports for several weeks. He was in a coma for a month. He was in post-amnesic state for about 6 months, and we flew and medevaced him over to Daniel Freeman Memorial Hospital in Inglewood, California, and I was flying back and forth because I have 5 kids, and 4 of them were here, and he was there. So it was quite a journey back in 1989. One day, when I was there and I was walking in, and there were 2 aides that were pushing him in a wheelchair, and he was strapped in with a sheet. And the 2 aides were speaking Spanish. And they were just chatting. They were going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and all of a sudden I saw a glimmer in his eyes. And I went, oh my God, did you see that? Did you see that? And they were like, So we talked to the doctors, and they started his recovery through his second language, Spanish. Got back on a plane, and I, as a mom, I called the University of Houston, Dr. Jack Fletcher, and you can look up all his work. He was doing language development, multiple language, with stroke patients with adults. And I said, Dr. Fletcher, I'm a mom, and this is what I've just experienced, and I want to know what happened, and what happens, and why did it happen, and how did it happen? He said, can you come see me? I spent the entire day with him, and he went through all this research. He's a neuroscientist, and this started the journey for the rest of my life. I said, I am going to figure this out, not only for personally, right, but for all the students in the country. Well, that's where it led me, actually, for all the students in the country. And I share that with you because it was extraordinary. It's like what happens in the brain when it comes to learning, whether it's monolingual language learning or dual language learning or multiple language learning, and there's so much that goes on with that brain that is completely applicable to what you are doing in your classrooms. And so we've spent years working with teachers in different environments, going through the information and having them test it out. And that's kind of what we wanted to do today. Dr. Wright and I have been colleagues for what, 30 years? Won't even get started on that. But there's three things I wanted you to take away today. All learners are language learners. All learners are language learners. And language learning is universal, whether it's monolingual language learning, whether it's dual language learning, or multiple language learning. The brain processes language exactly the same way, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then the last thing I want to take away is there are 6 components that influence language development. So here we go. So today the purpose is to share with you the 3 objectives and to learn to think about, to teach, and use strategies the way the brain actually learns. The key to learning is language. The key to comprehension is language. The key to reading is language. We all start with language, development of language. So the researchers who have been involved with this, Laura Ann Petito at Gallaudet University, Ellen Bialystok, you may have heard some of them, Marie Lyon, and Kathleen Snow. Kathleen Snow, who is at the University of Harvard, when I was in DC, she did this research study with superintendents and teachers at middle school and high school. And she was doing a presentation one day to this general audience in DC, and if you know the DC think tank people, it's, you know, monkey mucks, right? And so she stands up and her first statement is, all learning is language. And of course, this is my area, right? Well, I had promised a friend that I would behave myself that day, and as soon as she said that, I stood up in the chair and went, yes! And then I sat down, I was like, uh-oh. So, I mean, there were hundreds of people there, and I had completely lost it, because here's one of the premier researchers, neuroscientists. Look her up. She's at Harvard University. They've got neuroscience think tanks, et cetera, and she was validating exactly what we had been working on for a very long time. So it was a pure joy for me. Again, I'm sharing the stories. So what is language? Basically, language is a process. It's both nature and nurture, where it's an internal process where we learn the aspects of language, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, to make sense out of our world, to communicate making sense out of our world. And we can do it in 1 language, we can do it in 2 languages, we can do it in 8 languages. It's not about the language, it's about the processing. So language uses logical structures, real-world references to process, convey, and assign meaning to thought. And we do it through reading, writing, speaking, and listening, regardless of the language. It doesn't matter. This is fascinating. Indiana University, among others, has done research with women who are pregnant and have discovered, and this is from neuroscience, this is not behavior studies, that the last 10 weeks of gestation, baby in the womb, and this is just validated again 2 days ago. I was reading another abstract that's been published. The structure for language is developed in the womb. That neuroscience, the architecture for language is developed in the last 10 weeks of gestation with babies in the womb. And the interesting part about this is the fact that it doesn't matter the language. So if a mom is speaking Vietnamese, dad is speaking French, grandma is speaking Spanish, baby in the womb begins to distinguish among the three languages. Baby in the womb begins to distinguish among the three languages. When the baby is born, so one of the things we teach parents is talk, pregnant, sing, read stories, talk, play music, because babies can hear that and then they begin to distinguish the differences after birth. Again, all learners process language exactly the same way. And the interesting part about this statement, there's a foundation underneath it, which is race doesn't matter, economic status doesn't matter, ethnicity doesn't matter, and language doesn't matter. None of those factors matter. How an infant all the way through 17, 18, 19, and we'll talk about that, language and multiple language development is processed exactly the same way. So the thing that they discovered about bilingual learners is that there is a brain signature. There's like a bilingual brain map. And so when children are learning more than one language simultaneously, that signature is not just left brain hemisphere, it's left and right, and the whole brain is engaged. Oh, I wanted to, let's see if I can. One of the things that Ellen Bialystok's publishing, probably, she was on Time magazine, so you probably have seen this one statistic in the statement. You can begin to learn language anytime in life. And when you start learning language, no matter when you begin to learn it, what it will do is it will prevent the senioritis dementia. It will push it back 5 to 7 years. And we know that part of it's genetic, meaning it might be in your genetic structure, but just learning language, and it doesn't matter what age you start, it will push back, it will delay Alzheimer's and senior aging maladies. Ellen Bialystok. It means I don't get to use my hands as much. Sorry. They talk about optimal windows of language learning, and you heard from birth to 8, which is one of the primary times of language learning. But language learning never ends. So it continues on and on and on, unless, and this came out of Indiana University with students who are deaf. If no language is introduced till the age of 12 to 14, then a student will never, or a child will never learn any language whatsoever, which is really, really fascinating. The other studies that are talking about students who are deaf is that sign language imprints the brain exactly the same way as if you are hearing a language. So the same brain signature imprint. That research is from Dr. Laura M. Petito, who's the science director over at Gallaudet University. So this is just another me championing the fact that if we learn more than one language, we are super smart. So learning multiple languages engages the whole brain. It's not just left brain. It increases cognition. And Dr. Laura M. Petito, among others, has done research on if a student is learning to read from kindergarten, in 2 languages from kindergarten through the end of 3rd grade, and then they sit and take the STAR test, they will outscore, these multiple language learners and readers will outscore any monolingual speaking student, whether the monolingual is Spanish or English, at the end of third grade reading. So that's why we are allowed to say it increases cognition. Deepens comprehension and enhances executive function. And what that means is, when it comes to executive function, there are certain executive function skills that multilingual learners can perform better and easier than monolingual English speakers, or monolingual speakers, I should say, such as multitasking, such as multiple focus, and such as tuning out one thing to get to another, even though there's multiple things taking place. So what this shows us is the development of language and the sensory pathways that are first vision and hearing, and then language develops, and then we get to the higher cognition. This particular study is really fascinating because you've heard that according to the CDC, this is several years ago, the brain doesn't stop developing until about the age of 27. So we've got plenty of time to learn multiple languages. And it's the prefrontal cortex that is the last part of the brain that develops between the ages of 22 to 27. Now, as a single parent of 5 children, 2 boys, 3 girls, I can tell you for the guys, sorry guys, close your ears, it doesn't happen until they're about 30, 32. So this last section of development for judgment and wisdom and decision making, really, they say about 27, and I would, as a parent, challenge that it's really into the 30s. So we're allowed to let our children and young adults make lots of mistakes because they don't have the brain capacity that we think that they had before. So I want to talk a little bit about brain myths, and this is where you're going to feel a little bit challenged, possibly. Now, some of this may be very familiar to many of you, all of you, and some of it may be new information. This is where we really, because of the neuroscience, it really has challenged opinions that were developed over a very long period of time in the world of bilingualism and multiple language learning. So there is no right brain, left brain distinction in language development and language learning for multiple language learners, which we just talked about. There's no specific time allocated to language development in more than one language. What this means specifically, and we did have another researcher that analyzed the research on this, there is no such thing as 5 to 7 years that it takes to develop language to an academic level. That is not true. It depends on the quality of the instruction, the type of program. It's the input side. They keep researching the output side and not looking at the input side. And so they came up with this statement, I think that was what, Collier and Thomas years ago, that, well, it takes 5 to 7 years. It really doesn't. Margarita Calderon, Bob Slayman, and others have done additional research along with Dr. David Francis, who's also at the University of Houston, to dispel that it is not about time. And then when you look at the neuroscience and language learning and multiple language development, it has nothing to do with time at all. It's about quality of instruction. So there's no silent period. They talk about, well, students are quiet, right, during early language learning because they're absorbing the information. Part of that is true, except what we have to think about is that really true, or are we just keeping our classrooms or our home environment quiet? Because it's easier for us, especially, for teachers, not 100%, but for teachers, to say, well, so-and-so's not responding because they're in their silent period. Now, that's an old myth. I'm not saying it exists right now because teachers have a lot of interactive, talkative classrooms. When they talked about the silent period in language development, what they were saying, as you know, is, well,
the first 3 years, they're absorbing language and they're not ready to respond. They may be uncomfortable, they may feel intimidated, etc., etc. But take a look at the classroom environment or the home environment or the community environment. Are they being given and encouraged an opportunity to chat and talk and drive you crazy with sounds, etc., etc. So it's about the environment and what we allow them and pull out of them in terms of language expression. And as a single parent, I'll share this story with you. My other 4 children speak Spanish first, and English is their second language. I was together twice. So, second husband was native de Mexico, de las montañas de Mexico. He was from the mountains of Mexico, and so we only spoke Spanish at home. And so the rest of the kids were Spanish speakers first, and then learned English, and my eldest son learned English first, and then we lived in Mexico for years, and he picked up Spanish. So when they say a silent period, I say to myself, as a parent of 5 kids, wouldn't I have loved to have had a silent period with any one of the 5 at any point in time? Children are born with the ability to hear every sound in the universe. There are 435 or 450 sounds, and it doesn't matter what country you're in, it doesn't matter, again, your ethnicity, your language, your economic status. Every baby's born with the ability to hear every single sound. They do not start to discriminate among sounds or between sounds until about 6 to 9 months. And then what you'll see is if mom speaks Vietnamese, there'll be a head turning, Vietnamese. Dad speaks French, head turning. Grandma speaks Spanish, head turning, etc. They distinguish the sounds from the person that's their primary caregiver. So then they begin to prune away the neurons that are not needed for the other sounds, like if no one is speaking Japanese or Russian or Korean, etc., they're not distinguishing those sounds, so they lose the ability to hear those sounds in the same way. When we talk about whole student learning, I'm going to talk about environmental factors, and I think, let me see. Okay, let's start. The environmental factors for language learning is, the other thing is, on the other slide, that last slide, it's a no preferred learning style. And this is the other, you've heard a lot of people say, my Spanish speakers, the students from Spanish-speaking countries are auditory learners. Or from another group of students, maybe kinesthetic learners. Or another group of students are visual learners. And according to the neuroscience, all learners use all modalities. All learners use all modalities. So they hear, they envision, they see, they react, and engaging the whole student, which is what I mean by whole student engagement, whole student environment, is that you're building the brain from the bottom up. You're starting with languages, visuals, etc., etc. You're starting with sound, you're starting with symbols, and then you build up to cognition. And when in the classroom, middle school and high school students, as much engagement as you can have in all modalities, that you've got all students learning all the time. Now the brain changes. We talked about the first, quote, optimal language learning opportunity up until about the age of 8 to 10, and then language learning continues for students who are pre-adolescent. It starts at pre-adolescence, and there is a phase 2 of language development within the brain. And this is where neurons that have not been used start falling away, they're pruned, and new neuron passages are formed. So the brain begins to rewire. This is when I was talking about my brain development is complete by the age of 27. Let's just say 32. So there are 6 factors, and I'm going to quickly go through these 6 factors that influence all language learning for all language learners, which are really all students, every single one of our students. Then the fact that it also influences language development in multiple language learners or dual language learners. And this is where I had an opportunity to walk the halls yesterday with Dr. Wright. And some of you had your doors open, and so I just kind of peeked in. I didn't go into your classroom, I stood in the doorway. They are so beautiful. It was like, wow, you have actually read the research around environmental settings. And I'm going to show you some of that because it's just extraordinary. The warm environment, the lighting, the colors, it was just amazing. I'm like, can I spend some time here? So there are 6 factors that influence multiple language development. And let's go back to an initial concept. The reason why these 6 factors are important is because language development is important, because multiple language development is important. Without language, you cannot think. You cannot think without language. So multiple languages, you're thinking in more than one language, or you're reading in more than one language. But that's why this is so important. The first thing that happens with language development are relationships. The relationships between when an infant is born, and this goes all the way through high school and beyond. Relationships are the most important for language development. So it's the relationship between parent to child, caregiver to child, extended family to child, and then it stretches out into the community, where you continue language development and developing those relationships and right into the classroom, from early childhood classrooms all the way through high school. And I'm going to show you a video in a couple minutes about the importance of social emotional learning and the importance of relationships. The other is experiences. You can see on the one of our posters that it's experiences that inform learning and inform language learning. Culture is huge, and there's a wonderful story in the manual about a neuroscientist, Dr. Park, that did neuroscience research in multiple cultures, Eastern versus Western culture, and she did it with high school students in the United States and high school students in China. And you can see the difference, and it's really extraordinary what she discovered. How culture influences how we see ourselves, how culture influences how we make decisions, how culture influences the interaction among and between students and students to adults. And then environment, and we'll talk about this, the wonderful set of studies done by Dr. Peter Barrett in Salford, UK, and he is an archaeologist, neuroscientist. And you're going to have a checklist in here that you can say, is this in my classroom, is this? Gives you things to think about, because what you do for language learners, you're doing for all students. It's all students are learning language and can be learning multiple languages. And finally, language. Slide. So those are the 5 components here, and the other one is relationships. So I would like to talk about, and maybe Jonathan's help with this one, but
Yes.
managing.
Yes.
Dr. Patricia Kuhl, who is at the University of Washington, she's done some research studies, and I want to play a video for you where she discusses her own research and the importance of peer-to-peer instruction. So, and this is going to help justify what you all possibly are experiencing in classrooms. This particular study and set of studies, she's published a lot. She has presented many different conferences. She's got TED Talks. This particular video was snapped at the Aspen Institute. There's an extensive report that was published. That was 2019. So I pulled the video from that, but I've also had the opportunity and the privilege to meet with her and talk with her. What this tells us, what happened 21, 22, and 23? As teachers, where were our students? They were not in classrooms, especially middle and high school students. I know the babies weren't either. But kids thrive in learning in that face-to-face, whether it's adult to student, middle and high school student, whether it's peer-to-peer. This is how they learn. And so when everything shut down, talk about the politics of all of it, but when everything shut down and kids were forced, and you all were forced to figure out how to teach using computers, distance learning, scrambling to get information conveyed to the student when maybe they showed up and were part of the Zoom call, maybe they didn't, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was a very, very challenging time for teachers and students, which is why you see an extensive learning loss. So every student in every state, teachers in all states, are facing this challenge. We've done work with the state of Virginia, and Virginia was looking at the stats for their middle and high school kids around, I think, U.S. history courses, et cetera, et cetera. And their researchers in Virginia, this is recent, like within the past 6 months, said their students, middle school students in Virginia, in general, the state, they're not 2 years behind. They're 4 years behind. They're 4 years behind in reading, in math, in language processing, in grammar. It's not an individual state issue, it is a national issue. And when we were forced to take the kids out of classrooms for whatever the reasons were, and they had to sit in front of a computer, here's the research. 0 learning took place through computers. It's really challenging because the kids are on social media all the time. And so finding the balance of using technology in the classroom for supportive learning while you're teaching, now that they're back in classrooms, it's not to say don't use technology, it's to say how's the best way to use technology during instruction. And I think that's the other challenge that we all have. I don't think we've all figured that out yet. What happens with social emotional competencies? Kids become self-aware, they manage themselves, they have social awareness, acceptance, and develop relationship skills. At least hopefully they try not to hurt each other, right? That they have responsible decision making for their age and for grade appropriate. We also learn by doing. And this is also proven. The National Institute for Health has done extensive studies, and I put a little card in there. And the reason I put the card in there is so that you could go flip to our website. And if you scroll down under the tabs on the website, you'll see that there are research abstracts that you can have access to. Now, we are going to update the website. It's a little out of date. And we'll start that process in January, and I'd love to get your input on that as well, because we can add things that are important to you. So what do we know we learn by doing? And what this particular study has shown us is project-based learning is really, really helpful. When you take your concepts and you develop your classrooms and you set up your classrooms and you have the kids in groups and they're working in not heterogeneous groups, but diverse levels of language and diverse levels of, say, reading scores, et cetera, they're actually working together and using experiences to be able to understand the information, which gets back to the whole concept of whole student learning. So I want to talk a little bit about culture and the importance of culture when it comes to neuroscience. Again, you'll see some of those studies in the manual. But what is culture? Well, culture wires the brain. It gives us our own identity. We grow up in a culture, we learn about other cultures, and language is a reflection of that culture. So I may talk a little bit about Dr. Park's study, but I think this is fascinating. She looked at high school students, and this was with fMRIs, and they did a series of studies around decision making by looking, and I think the picture's in there of the elephant. And so what they showed the students in the United States high school is look at and describe the elephant and the picture. And they did the same with students in China, and I think it was Hong Kong, Korea. Don't quote me on that. It should be in the manual. But anyway, and what they were distinguishing is what's the difference of how students that are raised within different cultures and have different cultural expectations make decisions. And they did it using fMRIs. And so the students in the United States who were looking at the picture focused on what? The elephant. The animal. The students in Asian cultural countries focused on the background. They didn't see the elephant. It's really, really interesting. And then they did additional studies that said students in Western Hemisphere tend to be individualistic, that they make their decisions based on how they see something, a particular focus, whereas students in Asian cultures will tend to see a holistic picture and they make a more decision-making within a group context, which I thought was really, really fascinating, because then you've got students in your classrooms that are going to go through a decision-making process differently. And recognizing the fact that they may be coming from a different type of background and their expectation is different. And so they may be making a decision within a family context and not an individual context. That's fine. It's just understanding that there may be differences in how that output happens and how the decision making happens. So, what is culture? Culture are values, rituals, our norms, our language, and our customs. And every single aspect of that will impact learning. And of course, are there similarities and differences? Yes, and when you understand the similarities and differences, does it change your instruction? I think it changes the thinking around the instruction. Like opening up and saying, what are additional strategies that I may need to use to engage all of the students, and they might respond differently. And that's okay. The other aspect for learning is the space itself, and this work comes from Dr. Peter Barrett. So when he was looking at neuroscience, also using fMRIs, students from early childhood all the way through high school, and this is primarily in the UK, what are the factors that go into optimal learning and in your environment? The environment needs to be flexible, predictable, welcoming, warm, natural, accepting, collaborative, open spaces, stable, consistent, repetitive, challenging, experimental, exploratory, inviting, and interactive. I want to go back to the concept of open spaces. Oftentimes when we do teacher workshops, and this is not, and we understand this is often not possible in many middle and high school classrooms. I'm not saying it's not possible in yours. In many upper educated classrooms, it's not possible. I say, if I'm a chemistry teacher, if I'm an algebra teacher, take the desks out of the classroom, pitch them out, throw them in the hall, not literally, put them in the hall, and then look at your space and what needs to be in your space for optimal learning. Carpets, pillows, low tables, what is it, ergonomics, furniture that you can move around, and setting up your, say, experiments, if it's chemistry or biology, et cetera, on those tables. It's a different way of allowing students to collaborate with one another and learn. And so the old ways, the way I learned, is no longer the optimal way of learning, because they've learned so much about the environment itself. And color matters, choice of furniture matters, easy access to classroom and other connected spaces, which I think they have in the school, both schools. This is the one that's it. Minimalism. Now, when we work with early childhood teachers, and we say, you know, the walls should not be cluttered with stuff. Now, can you have things up? Of course. And are they warm? Are they tapestries? Are they, you know, say inviting pictures? Because we're talking about older students. So not only is there attention at different levels, but also what they engage with is different. And finally, I want to talk about language learning in the brain, but not in the way that I'd like to come back and talk about it later, because I didn't want to go into all the, today's like an introduction to the concepts, to the ideas, to the factors, to the components, but really delving into the development of language and the actual strategies that work across cultures, across languages, etc. That's another hour. That's not Joe throwing out the door. So, the fundamentals of language, and you can have access to the PowerPoint, by the way. So you're not dependent just on today, but we'll keep it so that you can follow it, and feel free to ask questions, etc. Is just to repeat the fundamentals of language development, and language learning of what we've set up so far. What I'd like to talk about, just briefly, the importance of distinction of language sounds. Now, I mentioned that all little ones are born hearing all sounds, universal sounds, and then they begin to distinguish. So there's the concept of nature and nurture. And the nurturing part, even with adults, even with middle and high school students. And think of it this way: if you cannot hear, if you cannot hear it, you can't read it clearly, and you cannot spell. You can't read and can't spell. So the distinct articulation of sounds is extremely important. And what does that mean? Well, in Spanish, the sound TH doesn't exist. Z doesn't exist. Zipper. Jump. J. Jacket. In Japanese, the R doesn't exist, the J doesn't exist. If the student is learning their first language, they hear their distinctive sounds. When we are teaching a second language, whether it's sequentially or simultaneously, we have to teach even adults the distinct articulation of the sound. So if I'm teaching English and saying Z, zipper, picture, phrase, blend, etc., and then I say in Spanish, there is no Z. And I'm going to go through and teach the discrete articulation of Spanish sounds, and then comparison between the two. So I pick on Spanish. They're both, as a Romance language, it's sound as simple is so much easier actually. But this is a process, and one of the things that we've done, and I would say we've done it with adults, we've done it with early childhood, we've never really done it with middle school and high school kids. You go to the store, you go to Walmart, get those fun noodles, you know, those things that kids splash. They're like, used to be 97 cents. And in early childhood, you can cut them into thirds or fourths, etc. And in high school, middle school, you just cut them in half. And then have a student on one side, when they're reading multiple languages, put the fun noodle up on one side while the other student expresses that sound, and then they switch. So S, and they're hearing the sound, see, and they're hearing the sound. And it's just a game. And so it's one of the ways where even adults have fun with this, with these quote fun noodles, so that they can hear and begin to hear in a playful way the distinct articulation of sounds, and you don't need complicated equipment. They don't need headphones, they don't need technology, you can do it using fun noodles. Once students or while students are learning the discrete articulation of sounds, what must we teach? We have to teach language and its content. What is it? What is the content? What is it telling us? What is it telling them? What are they telling us? How is it used in that context? How is language used? There's formal language, there's informal language, there's slang, there's text language, there's LOL, there's BFF, etc., etc. It's all language. And so students have to learn the difference among all students, not just language learners. And then the structure of the language, the form, the grammar, which is so difficult. Come from a world where I spent 16 years in Latin, so do I ever know how to diagram a sentence? So grammar wasn't really my downfall. But when I look at what goes on in schools around the country, it's many schools, most schools don't teach diagramming sentences. But what that helps with, and I'm not saying you should, but what it does help with is that students have a deep understanding of how language works. And when I'm editing other work on my own work, I always get frustrated about dangling participles. Like, oh, no. So, how do we teach content to L's through language? And how do we teach language to L's through content? How do we teach them simultaneously? There are a couple things to think about. You're going to teach at grade level. Do not modify the curriculum. Curriculum stays the same. The instructional approach may differ, but not the content in the curriculum, whether it's chemistry, or algebra, or literature, or US history, world history. The content doesn't change, the strategies change. So what are some of the things that I have to do when I'm thinking about instruction? I'm teaching all my students content through language. Language is universal, and I'm teaching all of my students language, 1, 2, 3, through content. That's how we learn. I'm going to skip up here first, and then I'm going to backtrack. So where do we start? And Dr. Wright is going to go into this in a more in-depth way. I just want to mention a few things, and then I'll turn it over to her after a break, which is we have to understand who our learner is. Now, I have a pet request, I would say. I have a request. When I'm teaching, what I like to get my hands on are student portfolios in the middle of summer. For the kids who we know are coming from the last grade into my grade. And I want to look at those portfolios. And I don't just want to look at the demographics, but I also want to look at, did they take the language test? What did that look like? How did they do in reading? They don't have to be just a multiple language learner or dual language learner. But what is their profile? What is their strengths and weaknesses? Did they have behavior issues? Because now I'm going to think about my lesson plans for the first 6 weeks based on the group of students that I have and based on a couple of other things. When we talk about know your students, first thing that we think about is your proficiency levels, and this is where Dr. Wright is really going to take you through this in depth in just a few minutes. And I'm just mentioning these things, and you can go back and look at this because she does this more extensively. So this is where I want to back up here. One of the things that I learned in my role at the Department of Ed was the fact, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what this law really says. When No Child Left Behind was passed and Title III was written, for the first time ever in the history of public education in the United States. It had never been written before. And I can tell you, when we got they FedEx the law to me the night that Bush signed it and said, will you take on Title III? I'm like, yeah, sure. Started reading the legislative language and I thought, well, they have no idea what they wrote. So one of the first things it says in the language is, every student must achieve at the same high level of academic standards and objectives that are set out at the state level for every single student in the state. Well, that's a mouthful. So what are those standards? And so you go back and take a look at your content standards and you say, it doesn't matter your discipline, you want to take a look at those content standards. And you say, what am I being able or required to teach in that content standard? And just look, every single state has hundreds of them. So you think, what are the priorities for the first 6 weeks of school, the second 6 weeks, or 9 weeks, etc. And what is it that I'm actually required to teach? And so this is the what of the what. What am I being required to teach? What must they learn? Do they need to learn algebraic equations? Do they need to learn how to structure a sentence? So it's what I'm required to teach, it's what they're required to learn. And then I look at the proficiency levels, and this is where I'm not going to go further with this because Dr. Wright's going to take you through this. It's through the proficiency levels that you will be able to understand that. I say one, will be able to understand how can the student demonstrate what they understand about that content standard. You've presented the content standard, you've presented and given it through strategies for multiple language learners at different levels of language proficiency with an expectation that a beginner is going to respond to you and to that content in a different way than a student who's advanced in their second language, not their first. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, and so I'm not going to go further with this right now. But Dr. Wright will, and then definitely would love to come back and work with you on this particular part of the concept. How do you make this happen in your classroom? When you review the language standards, just think about at what proficiency level, how the student will be able to demonstrate what they know in my content area in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. That's all I need to know, is that. How can they tell me that they understand the algebraic equation when they're a beginner? Now, they may be able to spiel it off like nothing in Spanish, because it's not that they don't understand. Of course they do. Of course they do. They have a whole foundation of language. They have a whole foundation of concepts. It's that they're learning to express it in a second language. So I could go in at the college or high school level and I've learned Shakespeare. So you ask me questions about Hamlet, or you ask me a question about Othello, I can answer you very easily in English. But now I'm in Korea. And they're asking me to answer those same questions about Shakespeare in Korean while I'm learning Korean. Can I answer in the same way? Can I express myself in the same way? I might be able to give the same answer or type of answer, but I might not be able to express it exactly the same way as if I were able to express it in English. And that's when it becomes about language. It's not that they don't know and understand, it's that they're layering a language on top of their concepts in their heritage language. And that's a huge distinction. So, if a requirement, I'm going to throw this out, but I think Dr. Wright will appreciate this. Requirement in the state of Texas. This is in 50 states, almost 50 states. U.S. history. U.S. history is a required course for graduation, right? 10th or 11th grade. Most states it's 10th or 11th grade. They must have 1 full year of U.S. history and passed it on an end of course exam in English. Awesome. What if a student came into the country in middle school in 10th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, and they're learning English, and they can sit there and spiel it out to you, U.S. history, in Spanish or in Russian, in any other language, their heritage language, but they are trying to tell you what they know in their second language. Well, we have an issue here, right? Because as teachers, we just tell us what you know. Tell us in any language. You get it, you understand it, you can articulate what happened in the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, the American Revolution, the US Constitution, the founding documents, they get it. But when you say now, you have to express all of that in a structured essay or research paper in English. It's like, oh my gosh. So the question that Dr. Wright and I have for many legislators around the country is, what are we going to do about this? Because it's not as if they can't tell us what they know. We are preventing them from graduating because they can't tell us a second language that they're learning when they just got into the country. Interesting. So I'm gonna stop there and leave you with that, just to think about that, because there are ways of letting them graduate and the fact that they do understand the information. And I'm not saying they shouldn't learn English. That's not where I'm coming from. No, because the more languages you know, the larger the cognitive capacity you have. So absolutely, learn 6 languages. When you are looking at your content standards, I want you to think about this. Does the level of language that you're teaching match the level of language that is required in that standard or in your content, in your curriculum? If there is a mismatch, you have to think through that. So you can't ask, say, Juan Joel to respond to an algebraic question if they cannot master the same level, or we're not teaching them the same level of language that would equal that content demand. Which is to say, by the 5th and 6th grade, we can't be using bell ringers or whatever they're called, worksheets that say, the house is blue. Why do we do this? Now, this is my world. We do this because it's a civil rights issue. And I'm sure that I'm repeating this, that people understand. Back in 1974, Kenny Lau filed a lawsuit and his family that said he could not graduate. San Francisco filed it against the San Francisco School Board. He couldn't graduate because he couldn't master the content and demonstrate it in English. And so the Supreme Court said that students must have equal access to the same content that's required of all students. The inability to speak and understand English excludes language minority group children from effective participation in the educational program offered by a school district. The district must make a remedy to allow students access into the same content at the same grade level for all students that are expected, for every single student that would participate in a program like algebra or calculus or literature, et cetera, et cetera. And Castaneda said, this is the second Supreme Court case, they actually came back with another remedy that said there are 3 things you have to think about. There's 3 prongs. And one is that the program that you are offering monolingual or multilingual speaking students must equal the monolingual English speaking students, and it has to be based on sound educational theory. That's why we're here today. This is what this sound educational theory is. It's the neuroscience of language and multiple language development that gives them access into your classrooms, into the content, and they will pass and graduate. And then, once it's implemented, this district or the state has to give adequate resources, personnel, money, programs, et cetera, for all students, but including language learners. And then after 3 years, they have to do research to see if that program works. And Texas Tech, this is also a Supreme Court case, said that no district or school can deny a student access to an educational program based on no documents. Then this got picked up into the ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Act, and you get to Title III, which says there's funding. That's basically what Title III says. There's funding. There's $1 billion that goes from the U.S. Department of Ed, from my former office. You push a button on June 30th, it hits the state banks on July 1st, and it's divided based on the demographic numbers of students of language learners per state, and then the state filters that money down to the district. The federal funds that go from the feds to the state is 8% of the state budget. So I used to kind of cringe when I hear, there's no money. I'm like, yeah, there's plenty of money. Where is it being spent? And how do we ensure equal access to equal academic success? Is teach according to how the brain learns. When we master those fundamentals, think about those fundamentals. What are the challenges in the classroom? What are the barriers that you face to be able to do that and problem solve together? And that's when we can develop brilliant thinkers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I appreciate that because that really. Microphone. There we go. One of the things I wanted to go back and share with you, so many of you were a part of the students she was talking about last year and did so much. We had 2 seniors that came their junior year. And we had one from Guatemala. We had one who actually, English was his 4th language. His native language was Russian. Then they lived in Ukraine, so they had to, during the wars, quit speaking Russian and learn Ukrainian. Then from Ukrainian, they were refugees to Argentina. So they learned Spanish. Then they came here and were working on English. When you come in 11th grade, that means U.S. history is coming at the end of the year. Okay, so what do you do if you're just into the language? One part of our law, Chapter 89, says you can't have language being the determining factor if you graduate or go from grade to grade. But then there's a graduation requirement that says you have to be seated in a class of American history and pass the EOC in order to graduate. What language is the EOC? What are all of them? English, right? We can't do that. We've been here 1 year. We're working on it, but we can't do it. It literally took us 2 years to figure out a way for them to graduate. He was in National Honor Society. It was incredible. Both of the young men were very, very good. But we couldn't get them to graduate, and we really had to circumvent, go around. We met the standards in some very unique ways. I had them do Ingenuity, American history, and Spanish. They made 90s, they made 80s on it. We knew they knew. But then they had to take the EOC. And what do you think happened when they took the EOC? They failed, right? Then I could come in with an LPAC and say it's okay, we're going to let them graduate. But they had to fail first. So what are we telling our students? You're working on language, you're learning, you've made an A on the coursework. We know, we want to know what you know. We want to know that you've been successful, that you can meet the standards. but then we're making them fail in order to say it's okay, you can move on. So that's one of the things that Kathleen and I were working with, going through TEA, and we have some friends on the Hill in Austin that are saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. And we're like, thank you, it really doesn't make sense. Because why are we requiring that when one side of the law, especially of our Supreme Court cases, back from the 70s and 80s, tell us, hey, you can't restrict just based on language alone. So that's what we're working on, and that's why it's so important. And you guys do such a tremendous job of working. And we work around, and all of you guys at the junior high, in November, we had 5 new students come in who did not speak any English. Y'all, that was not easy. And you guys just, I mean, I cannot tell you, I can go moment by moment how they worked with the kids, how we tried to work with them in 2 languages, what we ended up doing. You guys are awesome. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy trying to figure out how to get them information, make sure that we were keeping content on grade level, but we were able not to let language be a barrier. So that's what we're going to look at more this afternoon, and thank you so much, because the more we understand language, I think the easier it becomes for us when we get in our classroom to think, okay, this is beginning to make sense, what we're doing. So without further ado, y'all are going to get a little bit extra time to, and y'all, oh, you can add one thing. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, you pulled down. I got it.
And then I'll tell them, if y'all don't smell it, you're just going to put it on.
One of the things I hope that you will consider and help us with this year, we have access to a senator, really kind of more than one, at the Texas legislature this year. And the Senate Education Committee begins sometime in January. And we're asking if they would open up to consider an amendment to, within the state regulations, when it comes to graduation requirements for language learners who come into your districts, or all of the districts in Texas, at middle and high school. And not that we're saying don't pass the content areas that are required, yes, but how are we allowing for multiple language learning? Now, doesn't mean teachers have to go out and learn 6 different languages and teach the kids. What that means is that there are programs out there that can do text-to-speech translation. They can do, there are programs that are already developed in multiple languages. I think Google has one, there's ChatGPT. I mean, there's just a ton of things out there that would be helpful for what you are required to do in classrooms with students who come in with different types of backgrounds and challenges. And so it's a question of, when you look at the law, TA, Senate Bill, is it 561? I can't remember right now. And then you look at the administrative code, and then you look at the commissioner's letter, and you go, okay, it's very confusing, which is why I think it's very difficult for regional service centers and for superintendents of districts and principals of schools to say, this is what we absolutely have to do. There is conflicting messaging in the way these are written. And so working with you this upcoming year will be extraordinarily helpful to the work that we ultimately will do, not just in the state of Texas, but with me personally, and we're going to take this nationally. And so I have told to attorney friends of mine from MALDEF that one day I'm going to sit in the Supreme Court while they argue the case about what it really means to have multiple access to comprehension and content, and so it becomes a law of the land. So take the journey with us, please.
And one thing I want to tell you all, that I want you to cross your fingers, We found, in fact, it was brought to us back from the technology conference in San Antonio. I got some pamphlets. Y'all know, like in the, and we still got 10 minutes, but I'm gonna let y'all go early to your name. When you're like in the United Nations or whatever, you know how they have earpieces? And so the speaker speaks in their language, but the person hears in their language. Y'all, there's a chance we can write it in English. And students can actually put an earpiece in their ear, have it geared to their native language. You're instructing in English, and they're hearing it in their native language. Would that not be awesome? All right, fingers crossed. We're going for a grant. I've talked with Mrs. Moore. I know Mr. Aiken is going to be on board. We're going to see what we can do for our students. So it's going to be like the United Nations, so that you all can just instruct and they're hearing. So you're going to know what they know. And we use Google Translate, and the kids are they're taking your work off of Google Classroom, they're putting it into their language, they're answering it, then they're translating it back to English to turn it into. So that's when I say, y'all have it in Google Translate, that's what I'm talking about. That's what makes it easier, because then they can just use that technology. Because and we're going to talk about this afterwards, we want to know what they know. That's the key. We want to know what they know. It's not about we know they're a language learner. We know that. We just want to know what they know in their content. And so that's what we're gearing up to. Y'all keep your fingers crossed, and we are going to put in for a grant to be able to get a set of those for our kids. So anyway, y'all, they have the most wonderful snack up there. They have conchas. They have something, they have chocolate covered strawberries. They have something in chocolate that smells fine. I mean, you walk by and I didn't want to come back. And coffee and juice. Please go up there and bring it back. And then you all can have your restaurant breaks, whatever you want. And then we'll start up with our second part about really that gets us into our roadmap and takes a lot of the theory about language and puts it into practice. What is it going to look like in our classroom?